Hey guys, tonight we explore the entire history of ancient Rome, from a small village of shepherds on a muddy river to the largest empire the Western world has ever seen, and then all the way back down again together. As we begin with a disclaimer, this is going to take a while. Rome did not fall in a day. It also did not rise in a day. It rose over approximately 800 years, which is, by any reasonable measure, a very long time, and more than sufficient to put you to sleep somewhere in the middle of it. That is, in fact, the plan. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight we explore the boring history of ancient Rome together. If this is your first video here, take a look around. Subscribe if it feels like home. And leave a comment your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. We have a lot of ground to cover. In the beginning, and we are talking about a very long time ago, approximately 753 BCE by the traditional reckoning, though the actual date is somewhat contested among historians who have spent considerable portions of their careers arguing about it. There was not much. There were 7 hills rising above a bend in the Tiber River in central Italy. There were some shepherds. There were some Latin tribes who had been living in the area for centuries without doing anything that historians would later find particularly interesting. And there was a she-wolf, according to the legend, who suckled 2 abandoned twin infants named Romulus and Remus. The wolf detail is worth pausing on. Every civilization has its founding myth, and most of them involve gods, or heroes, or miraculous births. Rome's involves a wolf nursing human babies. This tells you something about Rome, not what it tells you about itself, but what it tells you about what it was actually like. Practical, a little rough. Not particularly concerned with beauty for its own sake. Romulus and Remus grew up, as twins in founding myths tend to do, and disagreed about where to build their city. Romulus wanted one hill, Remus preferred another. This being Rome, the disagreement was not resolved through negotiation or compromise. Romulus killed Remus and built his city on the Palatine Hill, and called it Rome, after himself. This too tells you something. The early Romans, the people who built the first settlements on those 7 hills, who organized themselves into a small city-state, who developed the first rough outlines of the institutions that would eventually govern the largest empire in the Western world, were not, by any stretch of the imagination, a sophisticated people. They were farmers and soldiers and occasionally pirates. They fought their neighbors constantly, the Etruscans to the north, the Latins around them, various other tribes and peoples who had the misfortune of living near people who had been nursed by a wolf and named their city after the man who killed his brother. But they were persistent and organized, and they had, almost from the beginning, a talent for turning military victories into lasting institutions, for taking what they conquered and building something that outlasted the conquest. This talent would prove, over the next 1,000 years, to be the most important thing about them. Rome began as many things in the ancient world began, with kings. 7 of them, according to the tradition, reigning in succession from the founding of the city to 509 BCE. We don't know much about most of them with any certainty. The historical record for this period is thin, heavily mythologized, and should be approached with the gentle skepticism appropriate to stories that were written down several centuries after the events they describe. What we do know, or at least what the tradition consistently maintains, is the shape of the monarchy's arc. It began with Romulus, who was warlike and practical, and more or less exactly what you would expect from a man who had killed his twin brother to settle a property dispute. It moved through a series of kings of varying quality and character, including Numa Pompilius, who was by all accounts a peaceful and religious man, who spent his reign building temples and organizing the Roman calendar, and doing the kinds of administrative things that never make for exciting history, but are genuinely necessary if you want a city to function. And it ended with Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, who was a tyrant in the classical sense, arrogant, contemptuous of the Senate, prone to having people killed when they annoyed him. The specific act that ended the monarchy was committed not by Tarquin himself, but by his son, Sextus, who assaulted a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia told her father and her husband what had happened, and then killed herself, because in the moral framework of the ancient Roman world, honor once broken in this way could only be restored through death. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had spent years pretending to be simple-minded to survive Tarquin's court, used her death as the catalyst for a revolution. He displayed her body in the Roman Forum, gave a speech, and drove the Tarquins out of Rome. The Romans abolished the monarchy. They decided they were done with kings, and they invented something new, the Roman Republic, which lasted from 509 BCE to 27 BCE, approximately 500 years, was, in the most generous possible characterization, an experiment in collective government that produced extraordinary results through a process of almost continuous internal conflict. The basic structure was this: two consuls, elected annually, shared executive power. Neither could act without the other's agreement. Neither served for more than a year. This was a direct response to the problem of king's power split, power limited, power temporary. Below the consuls was the Senate, the body of elder statesmen who advised and in practice usually controlled the direction of Roman policy. And below the Senate was the popular assembly, through which ordinary Roman citizens could theoretically exercise political power. In practice, the Republic was an oligarchy. The old patrician families, the aristocracy, who traced their lineage back to the earliest days of the city, dominated the Senate and the magistracies and most of the significant decisions. The plebeians, the ordinary people, were largely excluded. And so began approximately 300 years of what Roman historians called the conflict of the orders. The plebeians pushed for rights. The patricians resisted. The plebeians threatened to leave and found their own city. The patricians conceded enough to keep them. New rights were gradually extended. New offices were created. New laws were written down. Because one of the plebeians' central complaints was that the law was unwritten, and therefore subject to the interpretation of patrician magistrates, who were not always entirely impartial. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code, published around 450 BCE, were a direct result of this pressure. They were not a particularly enlightened document by modern standards, but they were written down and publicly displayed, and that mattered. Law that can be read is law that can be argued with, and the Romans were, among their many qualities, extraordinary arguers. While all of this internal conflict was happening, Rome was also fighting, constantly. The Etruscans, the Samnites, the Gauls, who sacked Rome in 390 BCE and left a trauma in the Roman psyche that would not fully heal for centuries. The Greeks of southern Italy, the Carthaginians, twice, in the Punic Wars, which were among the most devastating conflicts the ancient Mediterranean world ever produced. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. The second produced Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, who crossed the Alps with elephants, won battle after battle on Italian soil, came within striking distance of Rome itself, and then was ultimately defeated, not because Rome beat him in the field, but because Rome simply refused to stop fighting. This is perhaps the most characteristically Roman thing in the entire history of Rome. They lost battles. They lost armies. They lost entire generations of men, and they kept going. Not because they were braver than their enemies, necessarily. Not because their generals were more talented. Hannibal was, by most accounts, the more gifted commander, but because they had built an institutional framework that could absorb catastrophic loss and keep functioning. Because the Senate could lose 100,000 men at Cannae and meet the next morning and continue to govern. That institutional resilience, that capacity to absorb disaster and continue, was the secret of Rome's military success. And it was also, in a strange way, the seed of its eventual undoing. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic was under enormous strain. The wars had created vast wealth, but that wealth was distributed with spectacular unevenness. The old, small farmers who had formed the backbone of the Roman army were being squeezed off their land by large estates worked by slaves, slaves who were pouring into Rome from the conquered territories. The cities were filling with poor, landless citizens who had no economic role and considerable political anger. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tried to address this through land reform and were both murdered for their trouble. Several ambitious generals used their armies as personal political instruments. The Social War, fought between Rome and its Italian allies who wanted full citizenship, shook the Republic to its foundations. Sulla marched on Rome twice, and twice made himself dictator. Marius and Sulla's rivalry killed more Romans than many foreign wars. Into this world was born Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was, by any measure, extraordinary. A military commander of the first rank, his campaigns in Gaul, which he conducted over 9 years, and which he described himself in the third person in a series of commentaries of deceptive literary simplicity, resulted in the subjugation of the entire region of modern France. A political operator of almost unparalleled sophistication. A writer whose Latin was so clean and precise that it became the standard against which all subsequent Latin prose was measured. He was also ruthless, personally ambitious to a degree that bordered on pathological, and almost constitutionally incapable of accepting that the rules which applied to other people applied to him. When the Senate, alarmed by his power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he crossed the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper, with his army intact. This was, technically, an act of treason. It was also the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. The civil war that followed eventually produced Caesar as dictator. He was effective. He reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar, which with minor modifications remained in use until 1582 CE. He extended citizenship. He reorganized the provinces. He was also, by 44 BCE, effectively a monarch. He held the dictatorship for life. He wore the purple. He accepted divine honors. And on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, 23 senators stabbed him to death in the theater of Pompey. The men who killed him believed they were saving the Republic. They were not. The Republic was already gone, killed not by Caesar, but by the conditions that produced Caesar. What the assassins actually produced by removing the one man who might have managed the transition to a new political order peacefully was another round of civil wars that would last another 17 years and kill an almost incomprehensible number of people. The civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination eventually produced a winner. His name was Gaius Octavius, later Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, later still simply Augustus. He was Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, 19 years old when Caesar was killed, and possessed of a political intelligence so extraordinary that even Caesar, who was himself no fool about political intelligence, might not have fully appreciated it. Augustus won the civil wars, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, found himself, at the age of 32, in sole control of the Roman world, and then did something that no Roman strongman before him had managed. He learned from Caesar's mistake. Caesar had made himself dictator for life, and accepted divine honors, and worn the purple, and been killed for it. Augustus understood that the Romans, or at least the senatorial class whose cooperation he needed to govern, could not tolerate an obvious king. The Republic was too recent, too deeply embedded in the Roman self-image for a monarchy to be accepted in name. So he didn't call it a monarchy. He called himself Princeps, first citizen. He formally restored the institutions of the Republic. He gave the Senate back its authority. He declined the consulship after the first few years. He declined the dictatorship. He declined almost every extraordinary office offered to him. What he kept was more important. He kept the military. He kept control of the provinces where the legions were stationed. He kept a permanent tribunician power that gave him the right to veto any action by any magistrate. And he kept an informal authority so enormous that no one in Rome could meaningfully oppose him, even if they had wanted to. He was a monarch. He simply had the sense not to call himself one. The Augustan age, the roughly 45 years of his reign, was, by the standards available to the ancient world, a period of extraordinary stability and cultural achievement. The poets Virgil, Horace, and Ovid produced work that has never been surpassed in Latin literature. The building program transformed Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. The borders were consolidated. The wars, though they continued, were contained. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind something the Republic had never managed to produce: a system that worked. What followed Augustus was the Principate, the system of rule by emperors who maintained the fiction of the Republic while exercising monarchical power. Some of them were extraordinary, some of them were catastrophic. And the Romans, who were nothing if not observant about human character, developed over the centuries a remarkably precise vocabulary for the difference. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, was effective but deeply uncomfortable in the role. A private, suspicious man who governed well in the early years and then retreated to Capri, leaving Rome to be managed by a prefect named Sejanus, who turned out to be conducting a quiet purge of anyone he considered a threat. Caligula, who followed Tiberius, was, if the sources are to be believed, and they are not always entirely reliable on this point, genuinely unhinged. He declared himself a god. He appointed his horse to the consulship, or at least threatened to. He was killed after 4 years by members of the Praetorian Guard, which established a pattern that would repeat itself with some frequency over the following centuries. Claudius, who came after Caligula, was a surprising success. Considered by his family to be dim-witted and embarrassing, he turned out to be a careful and effective administrator who conquered Britain and expanded Roman citizenship and wrote a history of the Etruscans that has unfortunately not survived. Nero started reasonably well and ended by persecuting Christians, murdering his mother, and allegedly fiddling while Rome burned, though the fiddle had not yet been invented, and he was probably in Antium at the time. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian line, and his death produced a year of civil war, 69 CE, the year of the 4 emperors, that demonstrated how fragile the system was when military force was the ultimate arbiter of power. And then came a period of relative stability. Vespasian, who built the Colosseum and was known for his dry humor, his reported last words were apparently, "I think I am becoming a god," which is either the most Roman thing anyone ever said, or a very good joke about the tradition of deifying emperors. Trajan, under whom the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. Hadrian, who built walls, most famously in Britain, and spent his reign traveling the empire and reforming its administration. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who spent his reign fighting wars he didn't want to fight, on frontiers he didn't want to defend, and writing private thoughts about Stoic philosophy that he never intended anyone to read. The 5 good emperors, as this period is sometimes called, were followed by Commodus, who was not good, who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules, and spent his evenings fighting as a gladiator in the arena, and was strangled in his bath in 192 CE by a conspiracy involving his wrestling partner and his mistress. Rome was resilient. It absorbed Commodus. It absorbed the year of the 4 emperors. It absorbed a great deal. But there were limits. The 3rd century CE is not a period that features prominently in popular Roman history. It is not glamorous. It does not have figures of the stature of Caesar or Augustus, or even Caligula, whose awfulness at least made for memorable stories. What it has is 50 years, from approximately 235 to 284 CE, during which the Roman Empire came as close to complete disintegration as it ever would before actually disintegrating. In that period, there were approximately 50 different emperors, depending on how you count. Most of them died violently. Several reigned for less than a year. The average tenure was roughly 2 years. The military, which was the ultimate source of imperial authority, was simultaneously fighting external enemies on multiple frontiers and selecting and deposing emperors based on its own factional interests. The Persians were pressing from the east. The Emperor Valerian was actually captured by the Persian king Shapur I in 260 CE, the first and only time a Roman emperor was taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The Germanic tribes were pressing from the north. The economy was collapsing under the weight of military spending and currency debasement. The plague was killing tens of thousands. It is, in the bluntest terms, a period during which you could forgive a Roman citizen for wondering whether the whole thing was going to hold. It held. Barely. The emperors Aurelian and Diocletian stabilized the situation through force of will and administrative reorganization. Diocletian in particular implemented a series of reforms dividing the empire into eastern and western administrative units, restructuring the tax system, reorganizing the army that bought Rome another century and a half of existence. He also, as part of a broader program to restore Roman religious and cultural unity, persecuted the Christians. Which brings us, in its indirect way, to Constantine. Constantine I became sole emperor in 324 CE, having defeated his rivals through a series of civil wars that had, by this point in Roman history, become almost routine. What was not routine was what he did next. He converted to Christianity. The exact nature of his conversion, how genuine it was, how much it was politically motivated, whether the famous vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE was a real religious experience or a useful story, has been debated by historians for 17 centuries, and will probably continue to be debated for several more. What is not debated is the effect. Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, extending religious tolerance to Christians throughout the empire. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to settle theological disputes within the Church. He built churches. He returned property confiscated from Christians. He moved the capital of the empire to a new city on the site of the Greek city of Byzantium, which he called Constantinople. And with that last act, he set in motion, without intending to, the division that would eventually produce two separate empires and ensure that the eastern half would outlast the western by nearly 1,000 years. The decline of the Western Roman Empire is one of the most written about events in all of history, and one of the most debated. Edward Gibbon's account of it, published in the 1770s, runs to 6 volumes and approximately 1.5 million words, which is perhaps the most comprehensively boring thing ever written about a period of history. and I mean that with complete admiration. The short version, and I am aware of the irony of condensing 6 volumes, is this. The Western Empire was squeezed from multiple directions simultaneously. Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, Ostrogoths, pressed from outside and, gradually, from inside, as Rome increasingly relied on Germanic soldiers and generals to defend its frontiers. The economy continued to deteriorate. The administrative capacity of the Western government weakened. The ability to project military force declined. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, under Alaric, sacked Rome. The first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to an external enemy. St. Augustine, sitting in North Africa and working on his masterwork, The City of God, heard the news and wrote about the shock of it. Not just the military defeat, but the psychological rupture of discovering that Rome, which had seemed eternal, was not. In 455 CE, the Vandals sacked Rome again, more thoroughly. And on September 4th, 476 CE, the date conventionally given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a 16-year-old named Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, the name of the founder. Augustulus, little Augustus. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was named after its founder and its greatest ruler. And the diminutive suffix on his second name tells you everything about how seriously he was taken. Odoacer sent him into exile in a villa in Campania. He did not bother to appoint a successor. He simply governed Italy himself. And that was that. I want to speak slowly now to whoever is still listening. If you made it this far through the Wolf and the Brothers and the Kings and the Republic and the Civil Wars and the Emperors, good and terrible and mediocre, and the Crisis and the Conversion and the long, slow unraveling, I want to say something that isn't in any history book. Rome took approximately 1,200 years to go from a village of shepherds on 7 hills to nothing. 1,200 years. Most things that human beings build last decades. Some last centuries. Rome lasted 1,200 years, and then, in the form of the Eastern Empire, which continued from Constantinople, lasted another 1,000 years after that. And what it left behind, even after it fell, was everywhere. The language, Latin, did not die with Rome. It became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. It became the language of the church, of scholarship, of science, of law. The word you are hearing right now, language, is Latin. So is science. So is history. So, for that matter, is Rome. The law, Roman law, systematized and codified and argued over for centuries, became the foundation of the legal systems of most of Europe, and through Europe, most of the world. The concept of innocent until proven guilty. The idea that laws should be written down and publicly accessible. The principle that no one should be a judge in their own case. All Roman. The roads. Some of them still exist. Some of them are still in use. Beneath the streets of London and Paris and Madrid, Roman roads run through the earth like the memory of something that refuses to entirely disappear. The idea of Europe itself. The idea that the lands from Britain to Syria could be governed as a single political unit. That the diversity of the ancient world could be administered under a common framework of law and language and infrastructure was a Roman idea. Every subsequent attempt to unite Europe has been, consciously or not, a reference to Rome. Tonight, in whatever city you are in whatever bed, at whatever hour, you are sleeping in a world that Rome built. Not the Rome of the legions and the emperors, not the Rome of the gladiators and the circus, but the Rome of the roads and the laws and the language, and the idea that a village on 7 hills could, with enough time and enough stubbornness and enough refusal to accept defeat, become something that the world has never quite stopped thinking about. Let your breathing slow. Let 1,200 years of history settle around you like sediment. You have come a very long way tonight, and you are allowed, finally, to rest. The empire has fallen. The lights are low. And Rome, as it always has, endures. If this reached you tonight, leave a comment. Just your city and the time. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.